Right. Can you hear me in the back as well?
Yeah.
All right. Last but not least, we have an important question to address, and it has to do with doing justice to a text. A large part of what we do as research master students, as PhD students, or even as professors of philosophy is reading and interpreting texts. And we have to do so in a righteous or just manner. But what does that mean, doing justice to a text, to a philosophical text, but also to a literary or a poetic text? What, in other words, is the task of philosophical hermeneutics, a discipline that is traditionally concerned with explanation and interpretation in this regard? These are the questions that are at stake in the Gadamer and Derrida encounter, which therefore remains relevant for us today. Now, in order to find an answer to that question, we'll have to do at least three things. First, we have to determine how we're going to approach this debate, and therefore in what sources we should look for an answer. Second, we have to enter into the actual debate in order to find out where it is exactly that Gadamer and Derrida part ways, so that we can take an informed position in this debate. And third, we'll have to draw some conclusions and open up the discussion. So that's what we're going to do in the remainder of this presentation. Gadamer and Derrida first met each other at a colloquium at the Goethe Institute in Paris in April 1981. So when you hear philosophers talk about the Gadamer-Derrida encounter, this event is usually what they are referring to. Now, their exchanges at this colloquium have been, together with Gadamer's reflections on, have been collected in this book and have been, let's say, extensively commented upon. So today we're going to do something different. We're going to take our starting point in the shared admiration of Gadamer and Derrida for the German poet Paul Celan, and use their respective readings of Celan as a way of entry into the debate. In doing so, we'll focus on two sources in particular. First, a book-length essay by Gadamer from 1973, I believe, which is called Wer bin ich und wer bist du? So who am I and who are you? Which is basically a running commentary on a poetry collection by Celan. And second, a speech by Derrida, presented at a memorial conference in Heidelberg in 2003 in remembrance of Gadamer, who passed away in 2002. This text was later published as Bélier, le dialogue uninterrompu entre deux infinis, le poème, and translated into English as Rams, uninterrupted dialogue between two infinities, the poem, typically long and Derridian title. Now, this text by Derrida is interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it contains a reading of Celan, which takes into account Gadamer's own comments on Celan in Wer bin ich und wer bist du. So this choice of sources leads me to specify the guiding question of this paper to what does it mean to do justice to a poetic text, that is, poetry. Now, a intuitive and perhaps also classical answer to that question might be doing justice to a text means trying to find out what the author, in this case the poet, actually meant to say in his or her poetry. For Derrida, however, this is not an option. For him, the essence of language is written language, which is characterized precisely by the absence of the living presence of the author. I think he expresses this most clearly in one of his lectures on Nietzsche, where he says that Nietzsche died as always before his name. And therefore, it's not a question of knowing what he would have thought, wanted, or done. Next, the effects or structure of the text are not reducible to its truth, to the intended meaning of its presumed author. Now, Derrida makes a similar argument related to Celan, arguing that we can never be sure what Celan actually meant to say when he wrote this or that poem, but that even if we were to be sure, even if we knew exactly what Celan meant to say, then still his poems would be much richer than those intentions. Now, Derrida sometimes seems to accuse Gadamer of doing precisely this, of trying to guess at the intentions of the author, of the poet, but that's actually a false accusation. In the preface to his commentaries on Celan, for example, Gadamer clearly states that all that matters is what the poem actually says, and not what its author intended. And just a little later on, he adds that it is the poem which speaks, and not an individual in the privacy of his experiences or sensations. So Gadamer and Derrida actually agree on disqualifying the alleged intentions of the author when it comes to interpreting poetry. But then our guiding question remains: what does it mean to do justice to poetry for Gadamer and for Derrida? For Gadamer, the essence of language is spoken language, so communication or dialogue, which is also how he sees hermeneutics. For Gadamer, the interpretation of a text is like a dialogue with that text, aimed at gaining a better understanding of that which the text is about. So for Gadamer, doing justice to poetry means that we should do our very best to decipher its meaning, to arrive at an understanding of this poem. These are attempts at deciphering, he says about his commentaries on Celan. One must ponder, guess, restore, until finally one will have deciphered, will read and hear, perhaps even correctly, with correctly referring to a coherent and precise interpretation of the poem's subject matter. Now at this point, Derrida would already object by drawing attention to the importance of a certain interruption in understanding. This is actually one of the questions Derrida asked Gadamer in Paris in 1981, and which he recalls in his speech. At that time, indeed, Derrida says, I called for a certain interruption. Far from signifying the failure of the dialogue, such an interruption could become the condition of comprehension and understanding. Derrida's argument here is that if a poem would not also conceal its meaning, or leave its meaning in suspense, let's say, then it would not attract any hermeneutical efforts in the first place. If the meaning of a poem were directly evident, let's say, then there would be nothing to read or interpret, and hermeneutics would be done. Hence, it is quite surprising that at the end of his commentaries on Celan, Gadamer says that I believe I have more or less understood these poems. This is the kind of statement that would give Derrida the chills, and not in a positive way, because for him, such a final understanding means, I say it a bit dramatically, the death of hermeneutics. So in Derrida's speech, the tone is very different. I'm not sure of anything here, he says. Even if I'm also sure that no one has the right to be sure of anything here. And he adds, the certainty of a guaranteed reading would be the first inanity or the worst betrayal. Now, however, it is important here to grasp the nuance of Gadamer's position, because indeed, Gadamer does remark that some things are certain and can only be understood in a particular way, but Derrida would be wrong to accuse Gadamer of seeking to provide such a guaranteed reading. Let's have a look at this quote, for example. Conclusive interpretation simply does not exist, Gadamer writes later on in the epilogue. So, is Gadamer contradicting himself here, or can these statements be reconciled? I propose they can be reconciled when we see this idea of a correct understanding as a regulative ideal, in the sense that we should direct our efforts towards it, even though it can never be conclusively attained. So the goal of hermeneutics for Gadamer would be a regulative one, I think. Now, this may all remain a bit abstract, so I want to discuss one short example with you. In the poetry of Celan, you encounter a lot of personal pronouns like you and I. For example, in the line of verse that is central to Derrida's memorial speech, you have Die Welt ist fort, ich muss dich tragen. So the world is gone, I must carry you. Now it is not clear to what or whom you and I refer here. That's what Derrida would call an interruption. Interestingly enough, Gadamer recognizes this uncertainty. We do not know at the outside, he writes, what I or you means here, or whether I is the I of the poet referring to himself, or the I that is each of us. That is what we must learn. This is my emphasis. This last sentence is essential to the difference between Gadamer and Derrida. I admire the respect Gadamer shows for the decision, Derrida says. This indecision seems to interrupt or suspend the decipherment of reading, though in truth, it ensures its future. My emphasis again. So why does interruption secure the future of interpretation? Because it makes sure, Derrida argues, that we are never done with a poem or a text, that it forever survives every reading and interpretation. So what you and I mean here is not what we must learn, according to Derrida, but what we must leave open. We must leave the undecidable undecided. Now let's draw some intermediary conclusions. Gadamer thus recognizes the kind of interruption to which Derrida seeks to draw attention. And both authors reject the idea of a final or a guaranteed reading interpretation. We can conclude, however, that their positions diverge when it comes to the status of this interruption. So for Gadamer, interruption is an obstacle to be overcome in the process of striving towards a correct understanding of a poem. Whilst for Derrida, interruption is rather a positive necessity that secures the future of hermeneutics. Now we've seen what doing justice to poetry means for Gadamer, and we've seen Derrida's objections to it. But what we have yet to discuss is Derrida's own positive view of doing justice to poetry. Now this may look a bit chaotic, but please bear with me here because this is meant to be helpful. This is a visualization of a long quote from Derrida's speech, which I will not quote, in which he makes a distinction between two types of hermeneutics. The first one, he says, looks at the formal structure of a poem, at its themes, its ambiguities, at the idiomatic resources of the language in which the poem is written, perhaps even at the intentions of the poet, all in order to determine its meaning. These are indeed aspects Gadamer takes into account in his readings of Celan. These are all things he addresses. Now Derrida says, although this is all very important, and we should indeed take all this into account, there is always more to a poem or a text. There is always a remainder or excess of meaning, which makes these texts interesting for us in the first place. This brings us to a second type of hermeneutics, Derrida's own, which he calls a disseminal reading writing, which is oriented precisely towards this remainder or excess. So for Derrida, doing justice to poetry means doing justice to this remainder or excess of meaning. For example, by taking the words and lines of a poem out of their original context and inscribing them into new ones so that they gain a different and new meaning time and time again. This is actually what he does in his speech on Celan, where he takes just one single line from a poem by Celan, Die Welt is Sport, ich muss dich tragen, the one I quoted earlier, and which he takes up again and again in different parts of his lecture so that it continuously appears in a new light. Now, what can we conclude about the essential differences between these two approaches to hermeneutics? This is no simplification, of course, but I think you can say that on the one hand, Gadamer focuses on conversation or living conversation or dialogue, so spoken language, which leads him to a teleological reading strategy in which understanding is the goal, or at least a regulative ideal of hermeneutics. Derrida, on the other hand, takes his starting point from what is called the dead letter, so written language, which leads him to emphasize the necessity of interruption in the process of understanding. And this then ultimately brings him to a disseminal reading strategy, which, rather than seeking to approximate the true meaning of a poem or a text, seeks to demonstrate its multiplicity and possible otherness. We've also seen, however, that these categories merely represent differences in emphasis, I would say. As diverging as these hermeneutical strategies may be, Gadamer and Derrida find each other on at least two fronts, I think. First, in decentralizing the intentions of the alleged intentions of the author when it comes to interpreting poetry. And second, in their ultimate dismissal of a conclusive or guaranteed reading and interpretation. So I think we can conclude that Gadamer's and Derrida's positions are sufficiently refined to be considered as complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Now, finally, let's return to the questions with which we started this presentation. What does it mean to do justice to a text, be it philosophical, literary, or poetic? How should we understand the task of philosophical hermeneutics in this regard? Now, of course, doing justice to a text means throwing everything in the game to try to understand it. This is usually also what we do when we try to read a philosophical text, for example. The text presents itself as meaningful to us, and Gadamer should be complimented, I think, for following up on this experience of meaning. Doing justice to a text also means, in my opinion at least, doing justice to the remainder or excess of meaning which makes them interesting for us in the first place. Those texts that have proven themselves to be notoriously difficult or even unreadable, think of your own examples from Aristotle to Agamben, those texts are often the ones we are most eager to submit to our hermeneutical efforts. And Derrida should be credited, I think, for pointing in this direction. Now, finally, I think we should acknowledge, as both authors do, that interpretation is an infinite process that leaves open the possibility of other readings that will uncover new and unforeseen aspects and meanings in a text. The task of philosophical hermeneutics may thus be understood as approaching an understanding of a text and an articulation of its meanings that can, nevertheless, never be certain, final, or decisive. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for a beautiful presentation. I see your hand over there. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering how would you expand the disseminant reasoning from Derrida if we also bring to discussion the notion of his notion of text and not the literal notion of text. And I was wondering if, for example, Derrida's encounters with architecture, if he tried to do this even though there are not a lot of writings about that, but there's this project with Bernard Schumi in Arte de la Villette in Paris, which actually won this contest and it's got big. And it seems that their intention also with the notion of Torah was to, I mean, it really resounded what you were explaining here, because it seems that instead of allowing for these interpretive interruptions to completely text or poetry, the same was kind of happening with bodily inscriptions in material space as new ways of inhabiting public space, for example, as new ways of interpreting the I or the you as the functions of objects, for example, or of I don't know if you have something. I know it goes a little bit off your conference.
Yeah, thank you for this question of a Derrida expert here. Yeah, this is a good question. Of course, this presentation, I think, begs the question, okay, this is restricted to the domain of texts, but then what if we would indeed understand text in a Derridian sense? So for Derrida, il n'y a pas de texte, there is nothing outside the text. So text is meant in Derrida's work in the literal sense of like text, the books we read, the text we read, but also the world also has the structure of a text, because the world is also something each of us interprets. Then it would, the question would be, okay, what does this mean? What are its implications for such a hermeneutics for interpreting the world? And then the first thing I would think about, like before we get to these material, architectural interpretations, is okay, then this also has repercussions for how we deal with, how we interact with others, for example. So how do we interpret the other in its various manifestations? Which is also a question Derrida has addressed in much of his later work, which is more about ethics and politics. And there, I think you see this same emphasis on the importance of otherness, let's say. So I think for Derrida, we should always try to do justice to the otherness of the other, and then it becomes a bit fuzzy and metaphysical also. But then the danger is for Derrida in Gadamer, for example, that Gadamer fails to accommodate for the otherness of the other, and Derrida is very much inspired by Levinas here. So that the otherness of the other would be reduced to the same, for example, when we think that we can come to a mutual agreement, which is always the end of hermeneutics for Gadamer. Then I'm not sure, so if we take this step from text to the other, the interpretation of the world, and then to the world as such, also material issues. I know of a few scholars who have tried to make their ideas relevant for new materialisms and interpretations of, well, anything as such. I'm not sure what this would mean, actually. So indeed, there might be some kind of interruption going on in this architectural works, but I'm not familiar with those. So then I would love to hear more about that later, perhaps.
Other questions? Yes.
Very interesting presentation. As you know, I'm very sympathetic to the Derridian standpoint within this debate. And I like to talk about poetry, but I just have a question about the translation to the more scientific way of interpreting, like understanding a text, also for maybe more of a historical kind of perspective, because what I always feel when I read his take on that is that, okay, but where does that leave as a criterion for us to do science together? For you might know, for Derrida, each interpretation is unique. So in that sense, and I know it is not, Derrida would not say that every interpretation goes, I think, because then how can we do science? How can we move beyond like individual readings and construct? Because whenever I study Derrida myself and I talk with my supervisor and he corrects an interpretation of mine, there seems to be something happening there. It seems to be like a reference back to some original source. And is this not needed to do science or to do history? How do you think would Derrida respond to that question?
Yeah, not a Derrida expert. No, thank you. I think I see the problem, and then I think, first of all, Gadamer is more relevant in this regard, because in Gadamer, the goal of hermeneutics, not necessarily in the case of the text, but also in the case of the encounter with others, is always to come to a mutual understanding. So we debate the subject matter, and then the idea is that we arrive at some form of consensus, which is, of course, that's not what happens, I would say, but that's in some sense the ideal of the scientific community. And then I think you can see Derrida's objections much more as an extension, as I argued, like of this Gadamerian insight. In the sense that Derrida says, okay, but don't forget the importance here of these kinds of interruptions. So I think we had a really nice example today, the one about Aristotle. So in this text about democracy and knowledge from Tamar, is Aristotle a fan of democracy or not? Well, we're not quite sure. This is actually what keeps scholars of history busy these days, which is important work. And Derrida says, okay, but then if they would come like in this historical interpretation, scientific interpretation, to a mutual agreement, okay, this is what Aristotle thinks about democracy, then they're out of a job, let's say. So, of course, that's what we do, but then they have to acknowledge as well that how do we know their answer is the final answer? And of course, that's the methodological question Tamar addressed. Like, we're not sure. We should never arrive at such a final decision, because then we're done. Let's see. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, so in that sense, you need both, as you also argued earlier.
I
because
think they
are
are-
the critical perspective to keep on improving, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the thing is when you look into this Gadamer and Derrida encounter, at first sight, it seems they're radically diametrically opposed. And then when you look at the concrete text, it turns out that they are very much thinking along with each other and are complementary rather than exclusive.
I also have a question.
Sure.
So you talked about poetry, but then there was also about philosophy. But now these ideas that you've been discussing, do they extend or do they apply also for newspaper articles? So when I want to do justice to a newspaper article that I read, or I want to do justice to an invitation by, I just received the other day an invitation to give a speech somewhere, give a talk somewhere. Well, to me, it seems like doing justice to those sorts of messages is to capture the intention of the writer. The last writer intended to invite me to give a talk somewhere. So where on the, is there a sort of sharp line? It holds for poetry and yeah, for much philosophy, but then there's a dividing line, and then these ideas no longer apply.
I think this goes just as much for newspaper articles and invitations than it goes for philosophical text, literary text, poetic text. Because yeah, the same mechanisms, of course, of reading and interpretation are at play regardless of whether we are interpreting a news article or Aristotle's metaphysics. Because of course, even when we read the same newspaper article, we may come up with a very different answer to what its author perhaps meant to say, or even what this news article means or tries to convey. And then,
all right, but then when I read, for instance, in a newspaper, 20 bombs were dropped over someplace. Well, then I take it. Then I take it that what the author wanted to say is there were 20. He wanted to say this. His intention was to communicate the thought 20 bombs were being dropped. That seems like a definite. It seems entirely appropriate to say the text says this, and this is what the author intended to say. And that seems pretty definitive. I see no real problems with saying, this is an open-ended thing. So to be honest, I'm totally on the opposite side. To me, authorial intentions are what we are mostly after when we are interpreting text. We want to understand what Gadamer is saying. You made a big effort to understand what he was saying. And when people have a wrong take on Gadamer, you're going after them, which is okay. But the whole idea is we have a presumption when reading texts. Authors intended to say something. And we are just trying to capture what it is that he wanted to say. It's not something hovering over the text, but through reading the text, we just figure it out. The author said 20 bombs were being dropped on Dresden, and that was his intention, or her intention, or their intention to communicate 20 bombs were dropped over Dresden. So, what's wrong with that?
it's a difficult question. So what is the problem with this presumption of that we should look for the intended meaning of the author? I think this is a twofold issue in Derrida. So first he says, okay, how can we ever be sure what the author meant to say, or even if it seems fairly evident? So he gives this example in one of his lectures on Nietzsche. There is this text in Nietzsche's Nachlass, which says, I have forgotten my umbrella, which is between quotation marks. And then he says, okay, we have no clue what Nietzsche meant to say. And then he says, okay, is this not the structure of every text? So how can we ever be sure? But then let's assume, okay, 20 bombs were dropped on spot X. That's what the author meant to say. Then still, for Derrida, at this point is about the structure of language, how language works. Like writing works in the sense that we can also take these lines out of this context of this newspaper article. when we can take them for granted or not. And we can also inscribe this very sentence in another context. So we build like sentences before it, sentences after it. We do it in another semantical context. Then these same lines can come to mean something very different, perhaps even the opposite of what the author intended. And this is what Derrida's readings are meant to bring out, this capacity of language.
But then shouldn't we say the author put that sentence in that particular context? Because in that context, their meaning would become attractive for readers. And so this whole idea of, taking it out of that context, sure, taking sentences out of their context, they may acquire completely new meanings. Well, not completely new meanings. You shouldn't say that. Anyways, I'm misusing my position. And I'm not looking on the hand of others anymore. But these are topics that have been in my mind quite a bit. So we have to round this off. Here is well, thank you very much for